Hello there, I'm Toby Haydoke, and the burden of defence is entirely yours. Welcome to Too Much Information, which aims to tell you the who, what and when of Doctor Who, a television programme which demonstrates that seeking justice and upholding law can sometimes be two very different things. Whether you're discovering the episodes for the very first time, or you know your Orza rays from your Trevor rays, then you're extremely welcome on this odyssey behind the scenes, which aims to go through the series one episode at a time. In this edition, it's an episode which sees the Doctor return after a 2-week absence, just in time for one of the programme's rare forays into the courtroom procedural. So join me, Toby Haydoke, as I give you the who, what and when of Doctor Who, Sentence of Death, or Presumed Guilty. First broadcast on the 9th of May, 1964, at 5:15 p.m. It starred William Hartnell as Doctor Who, William Russell as Ian Chesterton, Jacqueline Hill as Barbara Wright, and Carol Ann Ford as Susan Foreman. With guest stars Donald Pickering as Ison, Henley Thomas as Taran, Robin Phillips as Altos, and Catherine Schofield as Sabitha. It was written by Terry Nation, produced by Verity Lambert, and directed by John Gorrie. It was watched by 7.9 million people, and the audience appreciation was 61. In the city of Millennius, Ian stands accused of murder. The body he found before being knocked unconscious was that of Yprin, Altos' friend, who had been searching for the last of the micro-keys. Speaking of which, it's vanished, even though there seems to be no way for the micro-key to have been removed from the vault where Ian discovered it. The Doctor arrives to defend Ian in court, but it's a daunting task. In Millennius, accused criminals are presumed guilty and must prove their innocence. Fortunately, the Doctor, Susan and Barbara quickly deduce that the real murderer is Aidan, a hot-headed guard who is part of a conspiracy to purloin the micro-key. But Aidan is slain before he can contribute to Ian's defence, and the conspirators soon turn their sights on the 4 travellers. The when. 3rd of February, 1964. The first 4 episodes of the Keys of Marinus are the focus of a meeting between Doctor Who story editor David Whittaker and writer Terry Nation at the latter's London flat. The two men engage in some general discussion about episode 5 as well, from which the plot arises. 25th of February, 1964. Having delivered episodes 3 and 4 8 days previously, Terry Nation has by now completed episode 5 as well, which is accepted by the production office on this date. It is dubbed Sentence of Death. 9th of March, 1964. Terence Cook, the organiser for the serials department, informs Doctor Who producer Verity Lambert and BBC head of serials Donald Wilson that there will be a schedule change for Doctor Who coinciding with the broadcast of Sentence of Death on the 9th of May. Although Cook mistakenly believes that this is the transmission date for episode 6. Doctor Who has been airing at 5:15 p.m. since the premiere in November 1963, and it was thought that this would continue until the 6th of June. Now, however, it has been decided that the 6 episodes starting with Mighty Kubla Khan, the penultimate instalment of Marco Polo, will go out at 5:30 p.m. Sentence of Death will then mark the programme's return to its original 5:15 p.m. time slot, since the Saturday afternoon Sports Showcase Grandstand will be running a quarter of an hour shorter. 2nd of April 1964. With the Keys of Marinus having been written at such a late date, the production team continues to struggle to provide timely information to the serial's key crew. On this date, designer Raymond Cusick finally receives the information he needs to get started on Sentence of Death, a full working week behind schedule. Cusick is not able to engineer the same miracles he did for Episode 4, The Snows of Terror, and when he delivers his design drawings on the 8th of April, they're 4 days later than intended. 3rd of April, 1964. William Hartnell is halfway through his 2-week holiday, which began after the recording of Episode 2, The Velvet Web, on the 27th of March. Today, then, he has sent the script for Sentence of Death, providing him with the luxury of 10 days to prepare for the start of rehearsals. In subsequent years, director John Gorrie will remark on Hartnell's mastery of his lines for Episode 5, after struggling through The Velvet Web and the opening instalment The Sea of Death. And indeed, while Hartnell will appear to stumble on a few occasions during Sentence of Death, we'll shortly discover that there's more to these slips than meets the eye. 13th of April, 1964. Rehearsals for Sentence of Death get underway at the Territorial Army Drill Hall on Uxbridge Road, with William Hartnell returning from his fortnight's holiday. Carol Ann Ford is next in the queue to get some time off during the middle instalments of the following story, The Aztecs. Unlike the Doctor in the Keys of Marinus, however, Susan will still have a presence in these episodes by virtue of sequences pre-filmed at Ealing. This recording takes place today, so Ford is released from rehearsals for Sentence of Death. 2 of the 3 Vord from the Sea of Death are back again in Sentence of Death, which actually marks their 3rd roles for the Keys of Marinus. Martin Court, who had also been the sword-wielding statue in Episode 3, The Screaming Jungle, now enjoys a more substantial role as the ill-fated Aidan. Peter Stenson, who was amongst the ice soldiers of the Snows of Terror, plays the 2nd judge. And he's not the only ice soldier brought back for Sentence of Death. Michael Allaby is Larn, the kindly guard who mans the desk in the anteroom, while Alan James is the 1st judge. In fact, of the 4 ice soldiers, only Anthony Werner doesn't get a new lease of life in Episode 5. But as we discovered last time, this is likely because Werner was a late replacement for Martin Court. One of the newcomers in Sentence of Death is Fiona Walker. She has brought herself to John Gorrie's attention by writing him a letter declaring that she is
far too good an actress not to be working.
Nearly a quarter of a century later, she'll be back in Doctor Who as Lady Painfort in Silver Nemesis. 17th of April, 1967. Sentence of Death is recorded at Studio D, Lime Grove. Also today, William Russell gets some local press as the West Herts and Watford Observer reports that actor William Russell, who lives in Hemel Hempstead with his wife and children, is the new president of the town's Junior Accident Prevention Council. There's just one snag. There is no badge of office to go with this new job. Mr. Russell became a children's hero as Sir Lancelot on television and is now appearing in Doctor Who, another popular series on children's television. He is not over-worried about the absence of a badge of office, but the young members of the Accident Prevention Council are. To overcome it, the Road Safety Committee, on their behalf, has agreed to sponsor a special competition amongst secondary schools in the town. Object of the competition: to find a suitable design for a badge of office that will do justice to the actor president. Alas, history does not record if they did, and if they did, what it was. 27th of April, 1964. Raph de la Tour, who portrayed the senior judge in Sentence of Death, responds to a letter of thanks that he has been sent by John Gorrie. De la Tour admits that, "My words not yet having reached the automatically foolproof stage, I feared that my anxiety must have been apparent. I'm so glad you didn't think so, and many thanks for telling me." 9th of May, 1964. Doctor Who returns to its 5:15 p.m. time slot with the broadcast of Sentence of Death on BBC One. Perhaps due in part to the scheduling change, the audience plummets by 2.5 million from last week to 7.9 million viewers. That provokes a 9-place slide down the weekly chart to 29th overall. The appreciation figure does edge up slightly, rising 1 point to 61. The What? There's a small but notable difference between Sentence of Death as written and as broadcast right on the very first page of the camera script. That's because it doesn't give the title as Sentence of Death, but rather as the slightly more awkward The Sentence of Death, using the definite article. In fact, this happens twice, on the cover page and at the top of the first page of the script proper. However, as we turn to page 2, where the instructions are given for the on-screen graphic, it simply lists the 3-word Sentence of Death. The closing scene of The Snows of Terror has been performed anew to open Sentence of Death. It's only in the Episode 5 script that Terry Nation properly describes the vault room, which is specified to be a small underground room, a detail not necessarily apparent on screen. Not all of Nation's vision for the set has been reproduced by Raymond Cusick. In addition to 4 or 5 glass display cases holding objects of great value, he also indicates that there should be, on the walls, other exhibits, including ornamented antique weapons. Presumably, the mace, which is about to figure prominently in the narrative, is intended to be one such weapon, but the walls are bare in the set as constructed. Ian's entrance also differs from the stage directions, in which we look out of the room through the partly open door. Ian materializes, gathers his wits, and advances toward the door. He looks in. We see the room from his viewpoint. John Gorrie greatly simplifies the staging by having Ian instead emerge from screen left, having already arrived in Millennius. The deceased Yprin, writes Nation, wears a semi-military uniform of modern design. On his forehead, a deep wound. Beside his body, a large mace. On screen, no obvious injury has been applied to extra Dougie Dean, and nor does William Russell examine the mace, as stage directions suggest he should. Dean will later appear once again in Doctor Who, uncredited as a Saxon in The Time Meddler. Nation evidently has lofty expectations for the skills of lighting supervisor Peter Murray. When the schoolteacher goes to examine the case holding the last microkey, the script states that the lighting throws Ian's shadow on the wall. We see a second shadow move up behind him, hand drawn back, holding a club, and about to strike. It seems that Nation had intended for this dramatic moment to be the cliffhanger to Episode 4, leaving the blow to fall at the start of Episode 5, along with the theft of the microkey. That's not reflected in the Episode 4 camera script, however, so this is probably a relic of the rapid redrafting that the Keys of Marinus underwent as it made its hasty way from the imagination of Terry Nation to the floor of Lime Grove Studio D. The stage directions also make no mention of the unseen assailant placing the mace in Ian's hand, so this is likely business worked out in rehearsal. In the next scene, Nation proposes a shot of room that's Ian's viewpoint, through his eyes, blurred, then clearing. Instead, William Russell conveys Ian's gradual recovery with a bit of post-concussive acting. In the script, Yprin's body is still in the same position, but now covered with a sheet. Taran will later gesture towards the floor when he makes reference to Yprin, so it seems that we're meant to think that his corpse has not been moved. However, the camera would presumably have captured a shot of the murder victim if Dougie Dean was still lying there, shrouded or otherwise. According to stage directions, Taran wears a close-fitting one-piece black uniform. From the heavy belt at the waist hangs a holster containing a gun of advanced design. Taran is 28, good-looking. Beside him is a small box with keys on it. It is a futuristic tape recorder. On screen, this device hangs by a strap from Taran's shoulder. The corded telephone on the wall, or as they would have called it in 1964, a telephone, isn't quite what's described in the script. Here, Taran works a lock, then speaks into a wall mic. John Gorrie's rapid cut to Ian after Taran accuses him of murder means we don't get the script's first clue as to the true identity of the killer. Aidan's face betrays relief. At this stage, incidentally, his name is spelt Aydon, although later in the script it becomes Aydan, which is the version reflected in the closing credits. Like many of the sets in Sentence of Death, the anteroom where Barbara speaks to Larn is a more humble affair than stage directions intend. The space is written to be very modern, with seats around the walls. Terry Nation describes Larn as a friendly, good-hearted man who interprets his job in the best possible way. The Doctor's imperious, "I am that man," in response to Ian's need for a man to defend him, gets the stage direction close-up of Doctor beaming, which should dispel all doubt, if any exists, that this is intended to be what John Pertwee would later dub a moment of charm. But the Doctor isn't just speaking rhetorically. The script is clear that the door through which he's just come leads to the courtroom, so presumably he's already made arrangements to be Ian's advocate before the tribunal. He is that man because he's already made himself that man. The next shot begins with the entry into the courtroom of the three judges, referred to as the senior judge, the first judge, and the second judge. This is an addition to the script, in which the judges are already sitting at the top of the U-shaped table. Ian stands facing the judges on a raised dais inside the two arms of the U. Defense and prosecution representatives conduct their business from each end of the U. Above the three judges hangs a sword. On the table in front of the defense lies a shield. In front of the prosecution lies an axe. Again, some simplification has taken place, no doubt due to a combination of budgetary considerations and the truncated amount of time which Raymond Cusick was afforded to design the sets. One feature of Cusick's courtroom set that's hard to miss is the presence of multiple swastikas, most obviously on the judges' platform, but also on wall hangings. The episode is littered with references to the totalitarian nature of Millennius, from the draconian legal system, which causes Ian such grief, to Larn's warning to Barbara that interrupting the tribunal could see her summarily carted off to the desert to work in a glass factory. Cusick's iconography helps to reinforce this point, although he's chosen a more curved, organic-looking version of the symbol associated with religions like Hinduism, for which it symbolises creation, prosperity and divinity, rather than the more rigid geometrical interpretation appropriated by the Nazi Party of Adolf Hitler. When the senior judge refers to the prosecutor Eisen, Terry Nation unsurprisingly proposes a close-up of the man. For some reason, John Gorrie omits such a shot from his camera script, even though we're about to cut to him when actor Donald Pickering delivers his first line of dialogue. By the way, Eisen is another name with an inconsistent spelling. It's E-Y-S-E-N everywhere in the camera script, except in the cast list at the front, where it picks up an extra E to become E-Y-E-S-E-N, which is the spelling used in the credits. In the Doctor's request to the judges for additional time, his statement that he has not considered every aspects of the case might sound like an instance of William Hartnell accidentally substituting the plural aspects for the singular aspect, but it's actually word for word what Terry Nation wrote. While his time off has evidently done Hartnell some good, in this case a small fluff would actually have improved matters. When his request is granted, the volume of the Doctor's "Thank you, my lord" is noticeably quieter, perhaps suggesting that a boom mic has moved out of position. A couple of stage directions are ignored after the Doctor's testy exchange with Eisen. First, the prosecutor is scripted to bow before he moves away. Then, Ian is meant to pat the Doctor on the back, although William Russell's position standing in front of William Hartnell would have made such a gesture pretty awkward. The Doctor's perplexing line, been starting and studied their laws, may seem like an error, but again, it's almost exactly what appears in the script. In fact, William Hartnell has made the strange phrasing slightly more palatable by adding the word there, where the script just has starting and studied laws. When the Doctor, Susan and Barbara are reenacting the circumstances of Yprin's murder, a stage direction suggests the inclusion of a chalk outline to mark the body's position. Oddly, the script also notes that the display case which had previously held the key has been shattered, even though there was no earlier indication that it should have been damaged at all. Indeed, the only description of the theft in the opening scene is that an arm reaches in and lifts out the key. The script doesn't include the Doctor play-throwing Barbara to the floor. Instead, a stage direction suggests that, when the Doctor mimes striking her from behind, Barbara turns and is quite frightened by the realism the Doctor is employing. After revealing that Aidan must be the murderer, William Hartnell seems to stumble over the line, "I can't prove at this very moment," initially giving it as, "I can't improve at this very moment," before seemingly correcting himself. But this is a third instance in which he delivers inelegant dialogue exactly as it appears in the camera script. Elsewhere, Terry Nation does explicitly provide a number of hms and hums for the Doctor, so it's not inconceivable that he's just picked up on Hartnell's occasional misstatements as one of the Doctor's character traits. But it does seem likely that this is an accidental duplication that bafflingly managed to survive all the way through rehearsals and into the transmitted episode. The living room of Aidan and Carla's residence is described in the script as very functional, modern, free from furniture, and rather stark. Although, half a page later, Barbara and Susan sit on a couch of simple design. Carla herself is 25, beautiful, tough, and ambitious. These qualities she conceals for the moment under a facade of gentle concern. When Carla asserts that Barbara and Susan must already know the value of the micro key, Susan's retort as Aidan enters is unscripted. The stage direction indicates that Aidan then towers over Barbara threateningly before she rises to her feet. After Susan claims to know the location of the micro key, Aidan's response is word for word what's given in the script, except for the closing reference to himself. Since it ensures that the audience is left in no doubt as to Aidan's culpability, it seems reasonable to infer that it was added in rehearsals. Also improvised is the dialogue between Carla and Aidan as Barbara and Susan eavesdrop. The script simply says that we hear Carla and Aidan's voices very indistinctly, both raised in anger. Barbara strains to hear. There is a resounding slap, a cry from Carla, then the slam of an interior door. There is silence for a moment. Barbara's view through the keyhole, actually captured by placing a keyhole-shaped mask in front of camera 2, is written to show only an unidentifiable hand pressing numbered buttons on a telephone of modern design. Susan is then scripted to urge Barbara to leave as footsteps approach, whereas on screen the decision seems much more mutual. Although it isn't obvious in the broadcast episode, Ison's half of the ensuing telephone conversation takes place in the anteroom, with him seated at the desk normally occupied by the absent Larn. At the start of the climactic courtroom sequence, Terry Nation writes that Ison stalks about dramatically during his closing arguments. The murmuring amongst the spectators after Ison's presentation is not in the script, which instead describes a brief conference amongst the three judges. The presence of the audience, including that of Barbara, Susan, Aidan and Carla, was meant to be established at the beginning of the sequence, while Larn's attendance is only mentioned in a later stage direction. As the Doctor calls Sabitha to testify, Aidan's scripted reaction is to appear very nervous. Desperately, he looks around him as though searching for an avenue of escape. His on-screen demeanour is more muted, consisting only of a few muttered words exchanged with Carla. Nation calls for another shot of Aidan, now very nervous, after Sabitha holds up her microkey, but John Gorry omits this close-up. After Sabitha accuses Aidan of giving her the microkey, the staging of the action diverges from the camera script. Instantly there is pandemonium, writes Terry Nation. Aidan leaps from his seat and tries to reach the door. He is surrounded at once by spectators. Taran and Ison have moved across and are in the group that surround him. Carla is also near him. He struggles furiously in the throng. It's only now that he protests about the impossibility of Sabitha having found the microkey. On screen, on the other hand, the crowd is more subdued, and Aidan's protest precedes his half-hearted attempt to flee the courtroom. As scripted, the weapon which kills Aidan produces an electric crackle, very loud. The crowd is meant to gasp and stand back as he sinks to the floor. Stage directions note that at his feet is a pistol of a modern type. In the finished episode, it can be seen on the floor near his right hand, although Camera 1 seems to miss its chance to give viewers a good look at it, pausing instead, and rather less helpfully, on a view of Taran's knees. After the fade to black, Terry Nation writes that order has been restored. Aidan's body has been removed. Carla is also missing from the court. Having established the positions in the courtroom of the other significant characters, he notes that the discussion between the Doctor, Ison, and the senior judge at the bench is informal now. Although Taran describes psychometry as a science on Marinus, it's a pseudoscience at best here on 21st century Earth. The word was invented in 1842 by an American called James Rhodes Buchanan. He postulated that objects retain a psychic imprint which can be interpreted by those skilled in psychometry in order to understand the history of that object. It's comparable to the ideas that Nigel Neal used as the basis for his classic 1972 ghost story, The Stone Tape. What's perhaps more remarkable about the conversation between Ian, Barbara and Taran is the interrogator's mystified reaction to Barbara's comment about fingerprints. Does this simply mean that the art of fingerprinting, or dactyloscopy, never developed as a forensic science in Millennius? Or is the implication that the people of Marinus don't have fingerprints at all? No stage direction is included in the script to indicate that Larn should fetch Barbara, Sabitha and Altos during the senior judge's ruling. Given the way that the next scene begins, however, it's clearly implied. The closing scene isn't quite performed as written. Larn is scripted to leave after telling Barbara that she has a phone call, and instead of the closing shot of the worried Barbara, the episode is meant to end with Barbara and Sabitha staring at each other, terror on their faces. The Who. Henley Thomas. Alongside Donald Pickering, whom we'll be meeting again, and as far as too much information is concerned, learning all about, in The Faceless Ones and Time and the Rani, Henley Thomas is the billed guest star of this segment of The Keys of Marinus. This was probably due in part to his starring role as Hugh Morgan in the BBC's How Green Was My Valley in 1960. Ernest Henley Thomas, to give him his full name, was born in Aberaeron, Ceredigion, Wales in December 1930. His television career has been solid if unspectacular to this point, with his debut coming in 1960's Julius Caesar, followed by episodes of Knight Errant Limited and No Hiding Place, and various television plays of the type common at the time. It continued in a similar vein over the next few years, although he had a short run of 3 episodes in Emergency Ward 10 in 1966. He'd been in it before, as a different character, but that was it. He did some narrating in 1970, but seems to have drifted away from acting into an altogether more spiritual sphere, joining the burgeoning Atlanteans, who ran healing courses and meditation and followed a spiritual philosophy which led to the establishment of the College of Healing in the Midlands, of which Henley became the very first administrator and worked tirelessly to establish. The college's philosophy is that there are fundamental techniques and principles which give an understanding of how energy flows and operates. Whilst there are as many methods of healing as there are healers, these principles allow all healers to fully develop their healing potential. Thomas was successful, and the college runs to this day. Too Much Information had a kind of communication with Henley Thomas a couple of times over the years, but nothing solid ever materialised, and Henley had been in ill health for quite some time when he passed away on the 4th of January 2020. Ralph de la Tour. Ralph de la Tour, playing the senior judge, was born on the 14th of February 1905 in Paris. He studied under Eileen Thorndike at the Embassy School of Acting in Swiss Cottage, graduating in 1934. In 1935, he was the King of Hearts in Alice in Wonderland at the Alhambra Theatre in Glasgow, before making his West End debut at the Piccadilly Theatre in Public Saviour No. 1, and then he was at the Embassy Theatre in Murder Gang alongside the Daleks' Alan Wheatley and the Seeds of Doom's Sylvia Coleridge. He joined the Embassy Players, a company made up of recent graduates from the Embassy School, designed as a showcase for young talent and headed by the star of his year, William Devlin, although the stage had described de la Torre himself as one of the Embassy's best actors. There was definitely something biblical about his bearing and manner, which accounts for the good notices he received both Tobias and the Angel, 1937, and Jonah and the Whale, 1938. Ralph de la Torre is an extremely worldly wise and knowing commercial traveller, his command of gesture assisting him to achieve an outstanding piece of acting, wrote one reviewer. At His Majesty's Theatre in 1939, his celestial judge in The Devil to Pay, Dorothy L. Sayers' version of the Faust legend, was also much admired, and he also did a virtuoso turn, doubling as Captain Hook and Mr. Darling in Peter Pan in 1940. Biblically flavoured work came to a head when he played Jesus Christ himself in another Sayers interpretation, this one The Just Vengeance. A commanding presence, said the stage, but if that wasn't enough, he was the voice of God himself at St. Thomas's Church's Mystery of the Passion in 1949. He often took part too in recitals and readings of religious poetry. He continued along a similar vein for the next decade, culminating with the operetta A Night in Venice at the Winter Gardens, Morecambe in 1959. He first broadcast on radio in 1937, and like last week's guest star Francis de Wolfe, became an oft-repeated name in the closing credits of audio drama, which would come to dominate his career, with over 500 engagements in the medium. He became well known for poetry readings as well as dramatic parts. His screen career began in 1951, in the second performance, so possibly a late replacement for Max Brimmel, as the Dark Courtier in BBC Television's Rumpelstiltskin, which marked the first uncredited contribution of Nigel Neal to British television. Ralph's most notable screen role was as Mr. Quelch in the 1955 series of Billy Bunter at Greyfriars School, although genre fans will be drawn to, but unable to see, his performance in 3 episodes of Lost TV science fiction fledgling The Trollenberg Terror in 1957. He was also at one time a Radio Cairo newsreader and translated classics from French into English, facilitating the first English-language performance of Girardot's The Trojan War Will Not Commence, among others. His last role was an uncredited one in the Elliot Gould film comedy Spies in 1974, a year before his death, aged 70. Some sources give his birth date as 1908 and his death age as 67, but on the balance of evidence, too much information is going with the latter. That patron saint of actors, Vernon Dobchev, the scientist in the War Games, made a bittersweet observation about his friend de la Torre's passing, which demonstrates that an actor's life has not, perhaps, changed that much over the years, and we shall leave the last words on our subject to him, as, frankly, no one could do a better job. I was saddened to read very belatedly in Paris that Ralph de la Torre had died. It is a melancholy irony that his passing should have gone virtually unnoticed until the publication of his will, enough to prompt every solitary character actor to reflect, there but for the grace of God. Ralph's latter-day presence endorsed his name. He looked like a crumbling Spanish grandee out of Alice in Wonderland, with an ardent blue spectacled gaze. Bad health and bad nerves had prevented him lately from exploiting on screen his grave El Greco appearance, and a certain lucid and resigned misanthropy largely confined him to a dusty basement solitude, where his piano, he both played and composed, was his main solace and distraction from the aches and trials of age and scant employment. Since we filmed together, I had been much abroad, and we exchanged postcards. His elegantly chosen and beautifully written testified to a stoical and sensitive spirit very much alone. I greatly regret that I did not make the time to visit him, and that these few affectionate words came too late to cheer a brave and touching colleague. Alan James. Alan James, who was an ice soldier last week, is the first judge this week, and the guard next week was born in 1940 and trained at the Webber Douglas Academy. He has 2 more TV appearances, both in 1965, Redcap and Fothergale Co. Limited. The BBC casting notes, after a general audition, refer to him as being certainly campish, and go on to speculate about his sexuality in a way that tells us how much even generally liberal establishments like the BBC have moved on in certain regards since the mid-60s. In the 60s, he also appeared in Rep in Perth, Great Yarmouth, Chesterfield, Lincoln, Watford and Westcliff-upon-Sea, and his career seems not to have been too derailed by his name appearing in the list of deceased members in a 1966 Equity publication, a record he had to publicly set straight. Too much information has deduced that Alan then started working professionally as a model in the early 1970s under a different name, which we will not disclose in order that he remain unmolested by Doctor Who fandom, which we have concluded is his preference, and he continues to do so until this day, and is represented by a number of top modelling firms in the UK. But alas, our attempts to confirm this 100% have not been successful, nor have our approaches to the erstwhile Mr. James. But if our conclusions are correct, then he's still very busy and in very fine fettle, and we wish him well. Peter Stenson. Peter Stenson was born Peter Gilbourne Stenson in India on the 19th of October 1934 and was educated at the Bedford School, Durham University and DePaul University in Indiana, USA. His national service was spent in the Royal Navy, during which time he became an expert frogman, which may well have prepared him for Vord life. He featured quite heavily in the pre-publicity for the Keys of Marinus. Keep an eye out for him next week too, when he trips over his flipper whilst vording it about. Despite appearing in several different guises in the Keys of Marinus, this week he is second judge, last week he was an ice soldier, and next week he'll be a Vord again, having played one in the first instalment. Like Alan James, Peter never again troubles a Doctor Who cast list. However, about Peter we know a little more. In 1959 he was on an Arts Council tour of A Winter's Tale and Peer Gynt. Also in the cast was one John Gorrie, who of course later gave Peter the opportunity to don rubber on Marinus. Peter was the undoubted star of the evening when appearing in Happy the Bride with the Penguin Players in Tunbridge Wells in 1961, and then he was in repertory in Hull and Newcastle. He had made his TV debut in epic Shakespeare landmark An Age of Kings in 1960, beginning a sporadic screen career that lasted until 2015, a short film called Cold Caller. He worked on television mostly in the 1960s, including a short stint on Emergency Ward 10, and his science fiction credits taking in the lost and little-known R3 and the Adam Adamant episode Face in a Mirror, 1967. John Gorrie used him again in the TV play The Sad Decline of Arthur Maybury in 1969, but thereafter it was mostly stage work until an episode of Terry and June in 1979. He also had a brief flourish later in life when he played a character with dementia in the film Lost Existence in 2014. He worked on stage for decades, taking work if he found it interesting. A highlight was the Phoenix Theatre production of Satyricon, which went to Broadway and ended up taking up 4 years of his life. He also appeared at the Gate Theatre, Notting Hill, in a series of comedy plays by John Antrobus, and at the Mayfair Theatre in The Unspeakable Crime of Maud Allen. He felt he had particular success as Sparga in Kennedy's Children. He also appeared in the London premiere of Alan Ayckbourn's Amazing Mr. A and performed in Smith at the Salzburg National Theatre. He also toured Canada in an aqua show with the British diving team, so clearly his time on Marinus, and more likely during national service, wasn't the last occasion he wore flippers, and in fact he remained a keen swimmer for the rest of his life, and was very into keeping fit. His later theatre included The Representative at the Finborough in 2006. He also has the claim to fame of appearing on stage fully nude alongside a similarly derobed Doctor Who companion, Caroline John, Liz Shaw herself, in the stage play Still Time, which was premiered at the Royal Exchange Studio in Manchester in 2000 and then transferred to the Southwark Playhouse in 2001. Peter also became a director when he put on shows at the London Central YMCA, an institution which became a very important part of his life. Indeed, from 1992 to 2005, he served as the director of the London Central branch. The YMCA, by the way, is the Young Men's Christian Association, and it promotes gym, health and well-being. He was in ill health for the last few years of his life, Peter, and died on the 20th of March 2020, aged 85. Let's hear now from Peter's fellow Vord, Martin Court. They met on the Keys of Marinus and stayed friends until Peter died.
He was a wonderful person. Not only was he a really, really great actor, he had a fantastic voice. He was so helpful. He went out of his way to help you if you were directing. And if you're an actor, he would quietly give you his opinion and advice. I was very fortunate to be one of the last people to see him before he passed. And I was happy to see that. I went to the hospital the day he was taken in. And he lay, I thought he was going to be distressed. He'd been on the floor undiscovered for some time. But in fact, he was lying in bed in a place in Paddington, in a hospital there, and he was quiet and serene. And when I got a bit upset, he was able to quiet me down and say, how he was so lucky. And then he went to Denver Hall where he died. I didn't see him again after that, but I was pleased that at least I had that last meeting with him. Very memorable man, and I was very honoured to have been asked to read at his memorial. I remember him still very warmly.
And so ends another episode of Doctor Who. And just when you think the Keys of Marinus has settled into a comfortable but repetitive formula, along comes Sentence of Death to shake things up. The first 4 episodes essentially consisted of the Doctor and his friends navigating a series of traps before attaining their objective in the scenario of the week. Only the Velvet Web changed things up significantly, but even there, the city of Morphoton can easily be interpreted as one enormous trap, with the brainwashed victims of the Morphos functioning as hazards to be overcome, every bit as much as the acid pools of the Sea of Death, the hostile vegetation of the Screaming Jungle, or the zombie ice soldiers of the Snows of Terror. But while Sentence of Death still adheres to well-worn melodramatic cliché, it's now abiding by the precepts of the locked room murder and the courtroom procedural. It doesn't even resolve the situation before the closing credits roll, so it's clear that we've moved into new territory, which helps build momentum as the Keys of Marinus veers towards its conclusion. Robert Holmes is often credited with popularising the notion that a 6-part Doctor Who adventure should consist of conjoined 4-part and 2-part stories, but it's Terry Nation and David Whittaker who are setting the precedent for that model right here. The breath of fresh air that this episode brings to the story isn't just down to a change of genre and pace, however. More obviously, we have the Doctor back after a 2-week absence. Ian is typically acknowledged as the heroic lead of these early Doctor Who stories, and that's a fair description. But there's sometimes an accompanying tendency to diminish the vital role that William Hartnell's Doctor plays in the series at this point, and one need look no further than Sentence of Death for a counter-argument. From the moment the Doctor announces his return, it feels like a hole is being filled that took shape over the last 2 weeks without our even being aware of it. It's like the silence that descends during a power cut, when you only gradually recognise the absence of all the little whines and hums that infest daily life. The Doctor's presence is invigorating, and smartly, Nation and Whittaker give him a crucial role in this week's narrative, one that unambiguously paints him in heroic guise for the very first time. The clever process that the Doctor follows to deduce the identity of the true murderer is a standout of these formative episodes. On the one hand, it fulfills the programme's educational remit by illustrating how logic can be applied to solve seemingly intractable problems. On the other hand, it reminds the audience that, even though he's travelling with 2 bright, capable schoolteachers who've more than held their own for the last fortnight, the Doctor's mind boasts a keenness of insight that sets him far beyond anyone else in his orbit. All of that being said, Sentence of Death still suffers from many of the issues that plague pretty much every episode of the Keys of Marinus. The supporting characters especially are very thinly and even ludicrously drawn. Taran has to jump through ridiculous logical hoops to maintain his stance about Ian's culpability in Yprin's death. The real murderer, Aidan, is so implausibly gullible that he almost seems to be champing at the bit to give the game away at every opportunity. Indeed, his cartoonish nature creates an uncomfortable juxtaposition for modern audiences when, off-screen, he can be heard to physically assault his wife as Barbara and Susan eavesdrop. Likewise, the implications of a society where the accused is guilty until proven innocent are sketched only lightly, the minimum necessary to provide this week's chief source of jeopardy. But even this manages to offer young viewers an intriguing thought experiment that they can mull over during the 6 long days before the Keys of Marinus finally reaches its climactic episode. Oh, and despite the dramatics and hysterics of recent events, very little has changed. Doctor Who, Sentence of Death, featured Michael Allaby as Larn, Raph de la Tour as Senior Judge, Alan James as First Judge, Peter Stenson as Second Judge, Fiona Walker as Carla, and Martin Court as Aidan. The title music was by Ron Grainer with the BBC Radiophonic Workshop. The incidental music was by Norman Kay. The story editor was David Whittaker. The designer, Raymond P. Cusick. And the associate producer was Mervyn Pinfield. Coming next, it's a tale of 2 halves, as the mystery on Millennius is resolved, and then the entire quest for the microkeys comes to an end back where we started. That's next time on Doctor Who, Too Much Information. Next episode, The Keys of Marinus. Or, in the beginning, there was the Vord. And in the end, too. Too Much Information, Sentence of Death was presented by me, Toby Haydoke, from a script that I co-wrote with Shannon Patrick Sullivan. Additional voice work came courtesy of Cheryl Lee Houston, with thanks to Richard Bignell, David Brunt, Peter Crocker, Stephen Griffiths, Ben Jolly, and special thanks to Martin Court. The series consultant is Richard Bignell, and the music has been specially composed by Wayne Shepherd. There is a supplemental podcast, 1 per story as opposed to per episode, called Far Too Much Information, which is for now exclusive to patrons, who also qualify for bonus material, early releases, and other exclusives, as well as pictures of my dog. Patrons are also nearly 6 months ahead with my Happy Times and Places podcast, so if you want to hear Holby City script editor Darren Thomas take aim at the deadly assassin, or a hamster with a blunt penknife maestro Joe Ford drop in on Spyfall, then head to patreon.com/Toby Haydoke. References. Too Much Information would, of course, contain far too little information if it weren't for the wealth of original scripts and production paperwork that has been unearthed and collected over the years. My debt to those responsible for this Herculean effort is beyond description. The production subtitles on BBC Video's DVD of The Keys of Marinus written by Richard Molesworth, are a treasure trove of insight and information. The Doctor Who cast and crew website always has great little nuggets and pointers regarding Doctor Who alumni and is a carefully curated resource. They have sadly just retreated from social media though, which is something Doctor Who fandom should be very sorry about. The earliest days of Doctor Who are chronicled by a small library of splendid reference works, from Jeremy Bentham's pioneering Doctor Who The Early Years to the titanic tag team of Doctor Who The 60s and Doctor Who The Handbook, The First Doctor by David J. Howe, Mark Stammers and Stephen James Walker, and culminating in Doctor Who The Complete History Volume 2, edited by John Ainsworth. Doctor Who The Complete History is co-edited by Mark Wright. The Complete History boasts contributions from Jonathan Morris, Richard Atkinson and Alistair McGowan, and of course it builds upon the archives published in Doctor Who magazine and written by Andrew Pixley. The archive for the Keys of Marinus can be found in issue 310, with updates in the 7th instalment of the Doctor Who magazine special edition. Also a vital resource in the pages of Doctor Who magazine is The Fact of Fiction, for which Jonathan Morris studied the Keys of Marinus in issue 445. Amongst its many charms is a number of additional word-vord puns, but we couldn't let Jonathan have all the fun, so we've done a few ourselves. And a discussion of relevant periodicals cannot end without an acknowledgement of that premier magazine of Doctor Who research, Richard Bignell's Nothing at the End of the Lane. Occupying its corner of the World Wide Web for 28 years and counting is Doctor Who, A Brief History of Time, open brackets, travel, close brackets. There, Shannon Patrick Sullivan provides another account of the making of the Keys of Marinus, although this one is rather more, well, brief, as it says on the tin. I walk in the shadows of giants who frequented the BBC written archives in Caversham so often the people who work there have probably installed a giant-sized door so that they don't bump their heads on the way in. If you enjoy my output here in Podcastville, you can support it by going to patreon.com/Toby Haydoke. Tiers start from as little as £3 a month, and as well as advance releases of these podcasts. I think patrons are currently 3 episodes ahead with Too Much Information and a few months ahead with Happy Times and Places. You also get bonus material, exclusives, and, as I've mentioned, pictures of my dog. Usually 3 releases a week. I understand, of course, that a monthly commitment is not always possible, so you can do one-off donations at Ko-fi, which is ko-fi, kofi.com/Toby Haydoke. There are no bonuses there, unfortunately. But if you cannot make a financial commitment, and that is totally understandable in this day and age when there are so many financial pressures on everybody, and so I totally understand. I'm just really grateful to you for spending your time listening to my output. But if you could give a little extra time, which costs you nothing, to go to Apple, iTunes, Podbean, Spotify, everywhere you can, even on YouTube now, where these go out just as audio only, but it's another way of disseminating this stuff, and give these thumbs up, 5 stars, and a few lines of review saying what you like about them. That just really helps with their visibility and presence on the internet and just makes it more worthwhile doing this. If you like and subscribe wherever you can, that just helps buff up the old algorithms. And those who've been doing such a thing, the patrons who support these podcasts, include Ruben Herfindahl, Peter Burns, James Curray-Smith, Peter Harness, Ronald Hayden, Rob Leonard, Christopher Meredith, Gavin McLean, Stephen Moffat, Richard Straw, Neil Tate, Nick Tedston, Jim Sangster, Keith Say, Graham Slate, David Shepherdson, Stephen, Neil Tate, Nick Temple, Damien Timmer, Sabrina Tirabassi, Apollo C. Vermouth, Gary Wales, Adam Westwood, Stephen White, Tom White, Michael Williams, Rhys Williams, Andrew Willis, Andrew Wilson, David James Wilson, Sydney Wilson, Andrew and Lisa, Kat Armitage, John Arnold, Kevin Ashleford, Luke Atkins, James Bell, David Bickley, Will Brooks, Gary Byrne, Robin Bland, Robbie C., Alex Caffajoglu, Paul Carnahan, Paul Carrington, Andy Case, Ian Clark, John Curley, Mark Dakin, Rob Dawson, John Elledge, Mark Findlay Smith, Joe Ford, Gary Gillett and Paul Goodridge. I'm grateful to them, but I'm grateful to you for listening as well. and I'll speak to you next time. Do tune in for the next episode of Too Much Information, because as we Doctor Who fans know, there's no such thing.